This video is going to test how easy it is to trigger conservatives and libertarians of all ages. Older conservatives have been engaging in extremely self-defeating behavior for at least the past few decades. Instead of blaming liberal policies and economic mismanagement for the decline of the country, they blame younger generations. Not only is this quite literally victim blaming, but it also displays a critical lack of self-awareness. Free marketers of all ages agree on basic things like private property, enforceable contracts, and paying your debts. This doesn't change if you are talking about the oldest, most cranky boomer or the youngest, most whiny Gen Z. Problems arise, however, when we start to say that all boomers are cranky, out-of-touch ingrates or all millennials are lazy. The reality is that neither group, especially conservatives and libertarians in those groups, are that way. But by blaming the other group for all their problems, they partially make the other side right. I will address the baby boomer generation first. They grew up in blissfully robust economic times when they could pay for college with a summer job and you could support a family of 5 and a mortgage on a blue-collar salary. Economically, there has never been a time in American history, and because they became adults in that situation, that became the status quo to them, how things should be and would forever be. So when they see millennials and zoomers struggling, they compare that to how hard things were when they were that age, not what the current generation is dealing with. Not only does this demonstrate a critical lack of empathy and hyper self-focus, but it ignores the reasons why the situation changed. Be it out of naive goodwill or a belief that the economy will always expand no matter what they vote for, the older generation is responsible for the economic policies that created the current situation. They created entitlements. They voted in taxes and regulation that stifle business. They created the corporate culture that rewards seniority above all else and teaches younger generations that there is no upward advancement. If you compare the buying power of the US dollar today versus 1970, you are looking at a factor of 6.71. That means if you made $30,000 in 1970, you would need to make $201,300 to make the equivalent amount today. And that isn't even the worst part. Home prices over that same range have increased by 14.6 times, over double the loss in value that the dollar has experienced. So when someone in an older generation is confused as to why millennials earning $45,000 at an entry-level job isn't buying a house, it isn't the millennials' fault. They are essentially earning the 1976 minimum wage. These problems are not caused by short-term decisions the younger generations are voting for. They are caused by the long-term systemic issues, overprinting, and debt spending that older generations have implemented. Basically, they voted for programs that would benefit them in the short term but destroy the economy for younger generations. I've already done videos on the college scam, but needless to say, the generation who raised the kids who got the bad degrees is the one who sent them to college with instructions to get any degree, and that was enough. They voted in the subsidies that turned a $20,000 education into a $100,000 education, and they never properly educated their kids about debt. But this isn't the fault of the boomers listening to this video, because despite all the horrible things that older generations did, it wasn't the libertarians and mostly wasn't the conservatives either who voted for them. Guilt is individual, not generational or by any group. Thinking that way is how we end up in a weird right-wing version of intersectionalism. Millennials were dealt a bum hand and their attitude, in a vast majority of cases, sucks. But as one myself, I can tell you why. They were born being told they could be anything and do anything. But when they try to do anything, or even just get by at a minimum, they find their path orders of magnitude harder than they were promised. The economy and job path their parents and grandparents talked about is non-existent. The life path, college, job, marriage, house, kids, everything is out of reach and completely unaffordable. The advice they got on their life choices and education was horrible and landed them in debt. They feel betrayed by their parents, their country, their schools, and in many cases God, even though God didn't tell them to do any of that. Remember, leftist colleges teach people to assign guilt by association. In many cases, millennials can become lazy. When you experience no positive results, no matter how hard you work, you are no longer incentivized to work hard. That is part of the natural incentive structure of human nature and the free market. By corrupting the free market, we have deprived an entire generation of the natural incentive to be hard workers. The result for hard work that their parents talked about simply hasn't materialized. The result for hard work that their parents talked about simply wasn't there. This isn't because they were lazy from the start. Many millennials have multiple jobs and work side hustles, trying extremely hard to have even a shadow of what their parents were handed. And then they were told by conservatives and older generations that they were lazy, not working hard enough, entitled, etc., instead of being told by those people that the leftists and authoritarians stole their opportunity and they should join them in restoring sanity to the government and the economy. 1,000% millennials are bitter and have thrown in the towel, declaring they are owed the same luxuries that previous generations were afforded. But this is because, just like when they were younger, they are not being taught the reason for their situation or reality. They were taught everything was easy by people who had it easy in comparison to every generation in all of history, and when it wasn't easy, they were blamed for not achieving the same things as a generation where everything was stacked in their favor. If you look throughout all history, no people group other than royalty has ever had such abundant opportunities as the boomer generation and Gen X in America. You could fail 5 times and still find 10 times the opportunity people have starting today. This isn't a bad thing, as lucking into a good situation is no more your fault than lucking into a bad situation. But it is reality. If one blames all millennials for the problems common among that generation, they must also blame all boomers for the easy life they were handed and the problems they created by raising their children poorly. But I stress again, we should not. There is a great many boomers and Gen X who raised their children properly, teaching them how the world works and didn't pollute their minds with ideas of easy opportunity or the toxic idea that you can do whatever you want and be successful. And more often, their children find success, but they are still dealing with a much harder economic situation. Now, if boomers are defined by unintentional entitlement and millennials are defined by bitterness and hopelessness, what would Gen X and Gen Z be defined by? I think Gen X lucked out because they got a head start while times were good, while still getting a glimpse of where things were headed. They were still young enough when the internet hit that they were able to adapt and take perfect advantage of the new world. I think most of the well-adjusted millennials and Gen Z were probably raised by this generation because they have less good times blinders. But don't get me wrong, they often fall prey to the same right-wing intersectionalism that boomers overindulge in and blame younger generations for things that are their own fault. I would say Gen X is defined by sarcastic pragmatism. Gen Z has the advantage of knowing how bad things are from the time they could think. They aren't being taught that opportunity just takes work and dedication, and they aren't being taught that a BA is a golden ticket to the good life. But they still have to deal with the horrible economic and regulatory situation put in place by older generations. They have been defined mostly by nihilism. But the takeaway is that you shouldn't accept any of these labels I just put on these generations. We should never define people by their group. People should be judged individually and by the individual struggles they have had to overcome. This is why whenever you talk about millennials, they are weak-minded, lazy, entitled brats who hate going into the office and drink way too much. Whenever you have a millennial friend, somehow they are a hard-working father who got a late start in life because he was dealt a bad hand. Millennials need to give boomers a break and realize their fathers and grandfathers aren't malicious and actually care about them and are confused about why they aren't as successful as they hoped their children would be. Boomers need to have compassion on millennials and understand they were only able to make decisions based on what they were taught and the situation in which they found themselves. Judge people individually, not by groups. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe.